And welcome back to our plenary session. I trust you enjoyed the breakout sessions. Thank you so much for your patience, your indulgence, and for continuing to engage here. Just a couple of outtakes from the previous breakout sessions. Partnerships for sustainable developments are key. We've only got one world to save. And there's a call for partnerships and leaderships. May we continue to work together. That's from Ezekiel Sekele, who's the Legal and Corporate Affairs Director of Zambian Breweries. Here's another one from Cecilia Torbrand, saying the only way to solve corruption is getting industries, the private sector, and government representatives to the front line as collective action to fight corruption. And one last one, saying we must rethink financial products and understand how this can impact development through consistent, tangible benefits. If you're looking for more outtakes, more feedback, and some of the great things that we've been discussing, please follow the hashtag Global Goals Local Business as we continue. I want to now take you through our second, or is it our third plenary session, I believe, and wanting to now focus on the issue of supply chains, both global and regional across the continent, have been severely disrupted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so our friends over at the UN Economic Commission for Africa put together some research on how companies can protect labor rights and still remain profitable. Now we'll get to hear more of this from Andrew Moles, who's the Chief of Regional Integration at the UNECA, in a conversation that is now being moderated by Paul Kapelos, who's the board member of the Global Compact Network, South Africa. Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Yvonne, and great to be here. Welcome, Andrew. We're very aware of the fact that the supply chains in Africa have been severely impacted by COVID, but we're so privileged to have Andrew Mould with us today, who's from the ECA and is the chief in charge of looking at the African Fair Trade Free Trade Agreement and the developments around that, who's, as you say, Yvonne, has done some really interesting research. And so welcome, Andrew, to this conversation. Yeah. Andrew, looking at your research, I think from East Africa, what can you tell us about the current state of play with the African Free Trade Agreement, and what your research is telling us about the impact of COVID on trade as well as supply chains in Africa?
Well, let me start by saying, clearly COVID's had a negative impact on trade globally and regionally. Some parts of sub-Saharan Africa have done worse than other parts of the continent. East Africa, actually, we saw an initial very sharp drop, particularly of imports, but also of exports across the region. But we've been monitoring quite closely the trends, and we saw actually in the third quarter of the year quite a strong recovery as well. And that was partially due to measures put in place by governments in the region, regional economic communities such as the East Africa community. I think this morning we heard from a gentleman from DRC talking about the measures DRC had taken as well. Temporary reduction of tariffs, for example. And actually we've seen quite an impressive bounce back for most economies in terms of aggregate trade. So that's to be welcome. With regard to your other part of your question, with the status of the AFCFTA currently, well, as we're all aware, it's going to come into force now within a month. And currently we have 5 countries in Eastern Africa which have ratified and deposited ratification instruments with the African Union. Now, 5 out of 14 countries in the Eastern Africa region doesn't sound that many, but actually they account for around 80% of regional GDP. So there's and they're also contiguous countries with land borders to each other. So, we're hopeful that things will start in earnest on the 1st of January. I would stress that this is a process. It's not going to be an immediate big bang impact. It's going to take place over a period of a decade, the liberalization for most countries. So we will gradually see an improvement in the trade in terms of trade between African countries. So I think that, given the current crisis, it's very welcome. It will be a good way for recovery.
Indeed it is. And how do you think the supply chains might be able to bounce back, being supported by this free trade agreement?
Well, it's going to be firstly gradually eliminating the tariffs on the intra-African trade component. Now, for non-LDC countries, that's going to be over a 5-year period. For LDCs, over a 10-year period. And that will be on 90% of tariff lines. And the ambition is to get up to 97% of all trade to be covered by this agreement. So firstly, there will be the gradual reduction in tariffs on trade, but there will also be these measures that will be implemented in terms of tackling the outstanding non-tariff barriers, which of course are a very serious impediment. I think in all the studies which show the large benefits that could come from the AFCFTA, a lot of those benefits are contingent on the agreement being accompanied by greater trade facilitation. So I think that's the next pending area of focus, I think, on the non-tariff barriers as well.
Yeah, just talking about the non-tariff barriers, what is the opportunity for the private sector over the next decade when a lot of these things are going to be negotiated? What would your call to action be for them?
Well, the call for action is just, we've recently been carrying out some analysis on levels of profitability across the continent in all the different subsectors, and levels of profitability are extraordinarily high across the African continent, much higher than you'll see in high-income countries currently. And that, I think, signals to the private sector that there are a lot of opportunities there for the taking currently. So if you look across sectors such as finance, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, food processing, you often find rates of return in excess of 10%. If you look at the activities also of foreign multinationals, and I believe we've got Unilever talking in the next session. That's now. Right. If you look at the activities of American multinationals across the continent, their level of profitability is on average twice as high as the level of profitability that the same American companies make in the European Union. Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of opportunities out there for both continental companies to grasp, and also for international investors to invest in productive capacities to build up those supply chains across the continent. Yeah, so whether it's a company like Unilever or Volkswagen, for example, all these companies are particularly interested in developing regional supply chains, and the AFCFTA will very much facilitate that.
And where do the opportunities lie in ensuring that labor and human rights are not left off the table? If you talk about great profits to be made, at what expense, and how does one ensure that these issues can be integrated and hardwired into these opportunities?
That's a fundamentally important question, of course, and I'd make a couple of points here. Firstly, the high profit levels that I mentioned in my previous answer are actually reflecting the extent to which the African market is not sufficiently competitive. And consumers across the continent pay excessively high prices quite often for the goods and the services that they consume. So on the consumption side, what we should see with the heightened competitive environment that the AFCFTA will facilitate, we should see downward pressure on prices. That is the experience that we've seen in other regional blocs, such as the European Union. Okay. Over time, downward pressure on prices. So consumers will benefit in that way. In terms of workers' rights, it's true that there's no social chapter in the AFCFTA currently. We're at the initial stages of this. I think it's important to recall that for the European Union, it did take them 3 or 4 decades before they included a social chapter expressly in the single market program of the European Union. So these things do take some time to develop. But I think where we're going to see the responsibilities lying in terms of making sure that labour rights, for example, good quality jobs are produced from this, is both through the corporate sector, through good corporate responsibility, and also national legislation as well to make sure. Possibly when we move on to greater stages of development of this continental market, we'll probably see discussions move into these areas of social rights and social protection more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll also hear from the panel how the competitiveness of supply chains also links back to these more softer issues, social and human rights type issues, labor issues, to keep them competitive. And any views on the competitiveness of the African supply chains relative to global competition?
Well, clearly the continent hasn't done that well in aggregate terms, in terms of its position in global trade over the last 4, 5, 6 decades. Our share of global trade is low. But I believe the hope is that with the Continental Free Trade Area, companies will take greater advantage of the opportunities in national and regional markets. And by doing so, they will become more competitive and more able to actually compete on the global stage. So that's the hope with this. And we see that actually there's a very different composition, of course, in intra-African trade currently, whereas to the rest of the world, Africa tends to export primary commodities with very little processing. Intra-African trade is much more diversified. So if you want to give an incentive to the diversification of African economies, the regional trade route is the way to go. And that's what we will see.
Thanks, Andrew. Good. Well, thanks very much for giving us that whole picture. And we're going to move into a video next. Giving us a very practical example on what's going on within a large supply chain in West Africa. So let's keep these thoughts that you've had in mind when viewing the video that we're about to see. So thanks very much, Andrew.
You're most welcome. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Obina Emeyonu, and I am the Procurement Director for Unilever in West Africa. As part of our commitment to sustainable living, Unilever is a long-standing and active member of the Global Compact. We also sit on the board of the Nigeria Network. As a large multinational, we also have about 1,000 local suppliers whose operations are integral to ours, and many of them are SMEs. The companies in the world's supply chain keep the wheels of industry turning and are critical to our operations. However, the COVID-19 crisis has surfaced several deficits in the operations of SMEs with respect to safe and decent work. These deficits have been significantly amplified in view of the severe disruptions to trade and distribution routes all over the world, including in Africa. With me to discuss the supply chain related issues today is the CEO of a leading company in the Nigerian logistics subsector, who is a vital part of the Africa supply chain and understands these issues very well. He is Mr. Segun Olugboegu, the CEO of Joff Nigeria Limited. Okay. What new challenges have you had to deal with because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how have these affected your commitment to provide safe and decent work for your employees?
Supply chain and logistics activity are hand in glove. It involves person-to-person interaction. Despite incorporating technology to support our operation, there are several day-to-day operations that will involve person-to-person interaction. This includes congregation within the office and the, say, drivers and what have you. And sometimes the staff are placed at third-party locations where people throng every day. And so the risk of infection and transmission is high, even though COVID-19 protocols are observed. We have had to introduce health and safety measure through the company to ensure that people are safer than they were hitherto. At the earliest discovery of any COVID sign with one of the employees, we ensure that the employee is tested and medical attention is given to him. Sometimes we also tell the employees that if they feel that they have any sign or symptom of COVID, they should stay away from work until the signs and the symptoms have become completely clear. This introduces naturally heavy workload for the remaining staff where some have fallen sick. So we've had to train more people to be able to double for other employees that are not at work. But even in that situation, in cases where there is experience and knowledge are tested, some of these employees falter. These are part of the challenges we had to deal with. And the implication of having to bring in new employees to ensure continuity had a cost implication that we could not pass also to clients.
How will a resilient supply chain help solve these issues that you have raised?
I think ultimately, one, the companies we deal with, our clients, will need to build a more robust partnership with us, the suppliers. Sort of partnership that will put suppliers in a strategic relationship with clients to ensure that they get more commitment out of suppliers. Carrying safety stock, additional stock that will operate as safety stock will go a long way to help in case of shutdown or supply shortage. Also, majority of the raw materials that are imported can be localized. Obviously, carrying safety stock, localizing supply will increase the cost of production, but ultimately, clients, suppliers, manufacturers will want to ensure that their goods are on the shelf at all times, which goes a long way than the extra stock, than the extra cost that they will have to bear. Of course, there has to be a balance, but we believe these are part of the many ways that you can help to build a resilient supply chain. Other ways would be to increase the number of suppliers or service providers to ensure that where goods are not available with one, you can turn to the other for supply.
How can businesses adopt a human-centered or people-first approach in building a resilient supply chain on the continent?
People are the currency of life and currency of business. Putting the people first in terms of voting part of the profit towards ensuring strong medical backup will go a long way to build the people that will do the work, to build up people that will do the work. And ultimately, the strength and the health of workers will help deliver strength and good profit. So I think voting part of the profit towards medical and good health for staff will go a long way to do this.
How can we use this crisis as an opportunity to strengthen supply chains in Africa and create more inclusion, equality, decent work opportunities for all employees?
Recently, Nigeria signed or ratified the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will take out borders within Africa and increase inter-country trade within Africa. I think that's a good sign because it means that raw materials that are not available in one country will be available in another country. It also means that you'll be able to move finished product across the borders freely. And obviously, you'll be able to source staff that from other African countries instead of going overseas. All of this together will help create a more robust supply chain, that is, supply of raw materials and distribution of finished product.
Thanks to Obina from Unilever in West Africa and Segun from the JOF in Nigeria for your really important insights. It was really good to get a very deep understanding of a specific case study as it's played itself out in the context of COVID and how a supply chain could become resilient to the challenges of COVID. It's great to have you all back here, and we've got a wonderful esteemed panel that we're going to enter into conversation with. The opportunity really is to discuss what's the way forward for regional integration, supply chains in West Africa. And this afternoon, we've got three panelists. Happy to have Sanda Ojiambo, who's the CEO and Executive Director from the UN Global Compact in New York. We've got Siddharth Ramaswamy, and he's given me the permission to call him Sid. Thank you very much. Who's from Unilever and is the Vice President for West Africa. And finally, we've got Mami Kalonda, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Finca in the DRC. We're going to have a few rounds of questions, but just tying back into what Andrew was saying earlier about the African Free Trade Agreement, we can really see that African countries are gearing themselves to cooperate more to allow for regional integration. And so starting with Sandra, in everything we've heard today, it's been some amazing contributions throughout the day with some really important comments coming through, which have been very stimulating. How can the COVID-19 responses be designed to lift the African economy quickly out of recession? We understand just how deep some of these impacts are happening, whilst putting it on a course to promote greater sustained and inclusive employment opportunities, and importantly, decent work for all.
Thank you, Paul, and greetings to my fellow panelists. It's really been insightful to hear views, from the free trade agreement possibilities and opportunities, and certainly, as we heard from the earlier speaker, about what this really means for business. I think responses will be multifaceted. Obviously, there's some very high-level policy decisions that are required. There's a need to look both really at the macro and the micro in terms of how businesses run. But as you've said, for me, I think what is really important is putting businesses, economies, and countries onto a path of sustained, inclusive, and certainly resilient growth. I think if you looked at the labor market situation in Africa, even pre-COVID, there were a number of challenges in terms of unemployment and underemployment. And I agree, a number of countries, as they move towards classification as middle-income countries, as they improve their manufacturing capacity, there are a number of employment opportunities being created, and certainly a lot more diversification in terms of trade. But as we know, of course, COVID has impacted a lot of this future-looking agenda. I think another big challenge really around resilience and growth is the fact that significant numbers of people on the African continent are employed in the informal and the micro sectors. Of course, this makes it very difficult to coordinate policy responses or regulatory responses. And the fact is, this very large population remains most vulnerable in terms of crisis because they lack social security, safety nets, they have very few rights at work, and they tend to be employed typically in low productivity jobs, offering comparatively low wages. So, you know, it's a delicate balance of policy and regulation, but also a full understanding that the informal and micro and small sectors do offer a certain amount of flexibility, mobility, and innovation. The SME sector is also very critical to servicing small businesses, yes, in country, but also larger supply chains. But ultimately, the fact is that there aren't enough employment opportunities, formal employment opportunities. So I think the question is, how do we harness the potential of this SME sector, the potential that business now has around a reset in the COVID era to generate a better business environment? I'll just highlight a few things I think that could help. I mean, certainly one, upskilling, I think is very critical. And I recognize that it's probably a challenge given the informality of large sectors of the economy. But I think it's really critical to move some of the workers out of low-skilled, low productivity occupations into much higher skilled ones. I think other areas are really looking at resilience, and resilience of supply chains, I think, is very important. Access to finance, I think, will also be critical, looking at social safety nets. And I think, you know, a key focus on women and young people, because they've been disproportionately affected anytime there is crisis. And certainly in the case of the COVID crisis, there's been impact. I think, you know, ultimately, if I go back to some of the principles of the Global Compact, this future-looking resilient business order really must ensure that we protect and promote the human and labor rights of workers and of the economy going forward. So I do think, you know, a mix of great policy responses as well as great business sector responses can help really regenerate the business sector. Underpinning it all must be a firm look at what resilience now looks like for the African business sector.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying was echoed by Andrew, in that the competitiveness of African supply chains needs to come through as a result of greater free trade. But as he said, in Europe, it took a few decades to hardwire the social issues into the free trade agreement. So it is going to come down to businesses and supply chains doing it for themselves and not waiting for policies and to force them to do so. And in the video, we had a really good case study from Nigeria about how this is being done. And what Obina from Unilever, you know, asked of us is like, how do we strengthen the supply chains in the context of ensuring safeguards for people in those supply chains? So Sid, you know, working with Unilever, you've got a very long history on the continent with very strong backward integrated supply chain. So in your view, what more can be done to strengthen the greater resilience and ensuring decent work opportunities, and how is Unilever positioning itself to achieve that?
Thanks, Paul. I think the first thing that we all as businesses need to do in Africa is put the consumer at the center of our focus. And that consumer is not a profit-generating machine, but a machine that, I mean, an individual or person whom we are serving. So we need to put service at the core of our principles. Yeah. So that's important. And the reason I say this is because that's what generates volumes, and volumes then generate jobs. If a large part of the African population is today finding it difficult to stretch their means, we will have to find how we serve them within their means to make sure that we are able to generate the volumes and create jobs. So start from that principle, because that is essential in how we work with our partners and how we create resilient supply chains. Then when it comes down to the work that we as Unilever have been doing, and I believe that a lot of other multinationals in this continent have also been doing, is that we be working with our business partners to really bring our inbound supply chains into the continent so that our growth is inclusive and it is more widespread, and it is not based on just converting a small part of a value chain, but really broadening the value that we add to our products in the local context. So we have close to about 1,000 odd suppliers, as Obina, you heard Obina say, in the continent with whom we are working. And specifically in Nigeria, the way to then improve the resilience and competitiveness of these suppliers and these partners is to work with them and bring our expertise to bear so that we are able to improve their efficiency, while we make sure that they are completely compliant with our global compact in terms of responsible sourcing, whether it is human rights, whether it is labor practices, whether it is to do with anti-corruption or environmental aspects. But at the same time, they are able to do so in a manner that is competitive and sustainable. And to that, we have to bring our expertise, and that's what we're doing. So we have a large team globally that comes and helps us in working with our partners in finding ways to improve their efficiency and their capability. That then goes in a long way in one, building them not just for ourselves, but broad basing them for all other people who would want to take the services, but at the same time helps us build our supply chain network, which will be far more reliable.
Thanks, Sid. I think your explanation around that is a perfect opportunity to move to Mami, who is responsible for a company that is working with small enterprise and small business. It's a financial services sector company. Mami, we've seen that the major impact of COVID, latest estimations from the ILO have suggested that the lost working hours are much higher than originally forecast in terms of full-time jobs lost globally and in Africa. But as a microfinance institution providing loans and other financial services to small entrepreneurs and businesses, some of which are in the Unilever supply chain, who are vulnerable, in the DRC, what, in your view, can be done to mitigate this risk for Africa? I know that you don't work in Nigeria where Unilever is, but in that kind of a context of trying to stimulate small businesses into multinational supply chains, what more can be done to enable this to happen?
Yeah, actually, for the micro customers, the base of the customers that microfinance institutions are working with, this sanitary crisis is a great opportunity also to build up the future of microfinance by trying to create synergies, by trying to transform the business digitally. By transforming business digitally, we are giving opportunities to the low-income customers, not only to be protected, but also to have that opportunities to get small loans at very fast loans when needed. And because we know that most, especially in Congo, most of those micro entrepreneurs, they live on day-to-day businesses. And during this the pandemic crisis, it is very hard for them to do the business regularly, to go out regularly. And if we as MFI, we don't transform digitally, we not only expose our customers, but mostly the business will not grow. So digital transformation should be really an opportunity. I've seen in DRC, some of the microfinance institutions, those have been thinking about transforming digitally, they had to rush and launch some of those digital products. Otherwise, it is very difficult for those customers to travel long distances, and what they will pay in transport can really help them to sustain during this crisis. So for microfinance institutions, this pandemic crisis, it should be an opportunity for most of us to think on transforming digitally and giving opportunities to customers to really reach out our business without necessary traveling long distances. So this require, of course, synergies. We are talking about chain. Chain is also about synergies. So for microfinance to reach that level, it requires synergies with MNO players. It requires synergies with agents so that customers can be protected and also be served so that they can improve their life standards and mostly reduce the poverty level.
Thanks, Mimi. I just want to circle back to Sid for a moment. With respect to your supply chain in Nigeria, you've heard from Mami about the need to digitize small enterprise, get them more equipped to enter into more sophisticated supply chains. What is your perspective on that, and how are things working out with your supply chain partners to try to encourage this development?
I think it's extremely relevant because data is what really helps in improving efficiency. So once we digitize and the entire value chain between the supplier, between our partners, both forward and backward with Unilever, for example, we find that our ability to really understand how a partner is performing, where are the opportunities for improvement, becomes extremely visible, transparent, and real time. At the same time, it also helps the supplier and the partner to really look at their own efficiency themselves in terms of their feedstocks, in terms of looking at how they are able to support. For example, let me take the example of one supplier with whom we are working, who is into sourcing cassava for us, and she is a local entrepreneur who is also putting up first time in the world, she's putting up a factory to produce sorbitol, which is going to be an input for our oral toothpaste plant, and she is doing that locally in Nigeria. She works with more than 1,000 odd farmers in sourcing cassava to be then to then process it. So if you then look at the whole value chain, starting from Unilever to this entrepreneur, her organization's name is Saltry, and then to farmers, you find that digitization then becomes so important in understanding lots of aspects. One is efficiency. Second is when we then look at the various aspects of sustainable farming, we look at our own goals of making sure that no one across the value chain is exploited, where the materials are being sourced from, that there is no deforestation. You find that the use of digital technologies become extremely important. So you look at in any way, any whichever way, whether you look at it from an efficiency standpoint, you look at it from a sustainability standpoint, digitization becomes absolutely it's just something that's absolutely essential. We can't do without it.
So Sando, when the Global Compact started and the 10 principles were forged, and I'm not sure if any of us would have imagined the rapid transformation of supply chains and the digitization of supply chains and open access to information and modernization, automation. The 10 principles of the Global Compact, the 17 principles, the development goals, the sustainable development goals, these are guiding frameworks. How are they helping with this transformation of African supply chains and this regional integration? And why are they, what is the nature of the framework that allows them to be timeless, to be able to reach the SDGs?
So, the 10 principles, as you know, when we were founded in the year 2000, were launched. And actually what Kofi Annan said at that point in time was that these principles and the founding of the compact was to bring a human face to the global market. And I think the 10 principles then personify what corporate sustainability and what responsible business should look like. And that's irrespective of whether you're in a position of, rapid economic growth or, fast business expansion, or indeed if you're in the position of crisis. I think what has been interesting for us to notice during the COVID period, there's been a marked and significant increase by businesses wanting to know more about our 10 principles, how they may help promote resiliency, strengthen supply chains during the COVID period and afterwards. So for us, it's been very clear and also clear demonstration from interested businesses that principles are needed. Principles are needed to grow your business sustainably and to grow economies. So if I look at the principles just very briefly, and we've talked about sustainability and resilience, I'll take the environment first. And I think that one, needs no debate. Clearly businesses can only grow to the extent that there's enough resources to support that. So it's very important that, businesses do look at their environmental footprint, do look at their carbon footprinting, and really look at how they manage extractives, to be able to be in business over the long term. Clean green business will be more sustainable. And actually, most recently, we've seen that even financial indices are reflecting that, where, financial indices have grown. It's because businesses tend to be more sustainable over the long term and more green. Corruption. I know there's been sessions earlier. The fact of the matter is that, corruption stifles growth. And corruption will stifle growth within a supply chain and will ultimately stifle innovation. So it's very important to keep the principle of anti-corruption core to no matter what we do around sustainable supply chains and business sector growth. Human rights and labor rights, very important. If you cannot provide a living wage, not just a minimum wage, if you do not look out for child labor, these are factors that will cripple your business over the long term. So for us, the 10 principles are really about setting the foundations for how responsible business should be. And with those in mind, you can then look at what your long-term business horizon is. Now, the SDGs, I think, add in an additional layer of principle and purpose, and also additional business opportunities, quite frankly, for business. Companies that we've talked about here, Unilever, others are extensively involved in addressing some of the SDGs, such as, eliminating hunger, no hunger, looking at providing decent work and economic growth around the continent and their operations. But therein also lies, I say, significant business opportunities. So for me, hand in hand, the 10 principles are foundational to running a business. The 17 SDGs, yes, they do contribute to, better prosperity for all of humanity, but they also represent significant sustainable business opportunities.
Okay, but we know, Mami, that in the DR Congo, almost 70% of the population is living below the poverty line, and 74% are excluded are financially excluded. So we know that there's this massive bottom of the pyramid opportunity. There's the demographic dividend of Africa is there. But how does this get changed in the next decade? So when we're sitting in 2030, what's it going to take to change this outlook so that there can be greater supply chain benefits for Africa?
Yes, actually, opportunity for changes is there. And what's need to change really for a country like DRC, a continent country with very low infrastructure. As I said, it's really required to create an ecosystem. I'm going to take just a small example in rural area in the middle, the center of DRC in Kasai. What Finca did with some of the farmers, they had enough produce that they could really sell outside the village. Unfortunately for them, the produce was there, but they couldn't get transport from the village to the city center that was Kananga. So what we did is, as Sandra was saying, there is that part, so there is corruption is there, poverty is there, but there is still a room when you work in a synergy to give opportunities to people. So what Finca did, for example, was to go and see the transport company. These people, they've produced, they have to transport them to the city, that is Kananga, and we as a microfinance company will be there to ensure that that transport is paid. They didn't have money though, Finca had to pay that money, and within like 48 hours, the maize and beans was in Kananga. So, and it took them, well, I was thinking that it will take like 1 week for those goods to be sold. We were really surprised that within 2 days, all the goods was sold, simply because we work in a synergy, coming from the farms to the transports, the rain transport place where the goods were supposed to be taken from. And from to Kananga, we created also another layer, the store room, where they can put those produce, and the information went out. Within 2 days, all the produce was sold out. Those customers who didn't have even money to pay transport, they were able to refund the transport money and to pay for the storeroom and also go back home with the cash. This is kind of synergies that is really required. And for it to succeed, we need more players in it. In this example, we had
for that comment. We're about to
discuss with the
run out of
transport
time.
company, with the government. And this is really what is required to reach to a good point and help this excluded population.
But in listening to that, Sid, what's your call to action for the private sector, listening to that?
I think the call to action for the private sector is to make sure that we work with our partners both. So first, put the consumer at the center of the whole equation. Yeah, because the more people become included in the whole aspect of economy, the better it is, and therefore we will have to make the growth inclusive. It can't be limited to only a few people. That's one. Second one is, in doing so, make sure that that what we can source locally, we source locally by building competitiveness of the local supply chains. That's the only way we can become far more firm, far more reliable. And in doing that, make sure that they are globally competitive, not just competitive in the local context. Yeah, because that's how it will be sustainable. And players like us will have to make sure that the whole aspect of global compact is brought to life.
Yeah, and what Mami is reminding us, thank you very much for reminding us of this, is that it takes collaboration, partnership, and synergies between organizations to be able to achieve that. In just a final point of reflection, Sunda, how does the Global Compact provide a convening opportunity for these kinds of collaborations to be worked out at a country level or indeed at a continental level?
Certainly, as I said earlier, foundational for us are the 10 principles, but certainly working through our local networks on the continent, we are there to work side by side with businesses to see how we can support them really build these much needed, sustainable and resilient supply chains. The opportunity truly to act is now.
Yeah, well, thank you to Sunda, thank you to Sid and for Mami for all your very insightful thoughts and considerations of I guess how to manage our way out of this current impact, but to leverage off this and to make the most of what the next decade offers. From Andrew earlier, everything is being put in place, and it's up to all of us to work out how to collaborate better and to create those opportunities in the African supply chains for employees and the workers and the millions of people relying on the economic benefits for sustaining livelihoods, securing healthcare, education, and being able to invest in communities. So thank you very much.